Welcome to our next lesson in a bird's eye view of Old Testament history as we're studying together the books of Genesis through Esther. And we understand that human philosophers are always attempting to answer three basic questions. Philosophy tries to answer the question of where did I come from, and why am I here, and where am I going? And it's interesting that the Bible has the answer to all three of those questions, especially the first two, where did I come from and why am I here? They're answered so readily for us in the very first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. Final question, where am I going? Answered in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. Today we're going to take a look at the very opening chapters of the book of Genesis that answers that question, where did I come from and why am I here? These chapters are filled with all kinds of foundational truth that help us understand not only answers to philosophical questions, answers to practical questions about our lives and the world around us, but also help us to understand the rest of the Bible as well. So Genesis 1 through 11 are very much the foundation for our study of the Old Testament as well as the New. Before we get into the study of those first chapters, it would be helpful for us to understand a little bit of background about what we call the Pentateuch. That word simply refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses, we might call them: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. And when we have a moment to think about this introduction to the Pentateuch, we need to realize that people have approached these 5 books in a couple of different and significantly different ways, especially when it comes to the authorship of these books. There's a critical theory that would say that Moses isn't really the author of these books. This critical theory is sometimes called the JEDP theory, and we'll see why in just a moment. But according to this theory, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written over a process of time by a number of authors who provided editorial help along the way to come up with what we have as the finished product. And so this Pentateuch is a compilation of selected writings arranged by various editors over several hundred years, according to the critical theory. And these writings can be identified by the use of the names of Jehovah and Elohim. So in certain sections, we'll find the name for God as Jehovah or Yahweh, the J sections of that JEDP theory. Other places we'll find an emphasis on the name for God, Elohim, the Mighty One. The E sections in those documents in the JEDP theory. And so these different authors with different titles for God were blended together or edited together into a single document. Later, according to this theory, other editors came along and added what we call a Deuteronomy and a priestly group of writings. So the D, Deuteronomy, or a law code in the JEDP, and a priestly document that focuses on priestly functions, JEDP. So there's the idea of multiple authors over a process of time pulling together, weaving together the books that we have as the Pentateuch. This is the critical theory of the Old Testament. The critical theory then of the Pentateuch would say that it was written long after the death of Moses, that Moses really didn't play a role in the writing of these books. This theory is very popular, of course, and we know that it has a lot of very scholarly people who would support it. We also would understand that it violates some of the very plain statements of the Bible itself. This is why we lean back to what we would call the traditional theory. The traditional theory about the Pentateuch simply says that Moses was indeed the author of these 5 books. There was no editing along centuries. There was no composition by multiple authors. It was really the work of Moses and his penmanship. And we know that this is what the Bible teaches us in regard to itself when it speaks about itself, because there are a number of places in the Old Testament itself that refer to these books as the writings of Moses, the books of Moses. And so we find in books like Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy making that claim, Joshua and 1 Kings and 2 Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel and Malachi, all making claim that these books were the books of Moses. And so if we take those statements literally as they're intended to be taken in Scripture, we would understand that Moses was indeed the author of the Pentateuch. We find the similar situation in the New Testament, because the New Testament presents Moses as the author of the Pentateuch as well. Matthew writes about that in John, and we read about that in the book of Acts and Romans. And so these places talk about the books of Moses. So to cast those aside, we would have to say that these other statements, these other writers were incorrect or misled in understanding who the author of the Pentateuch was. And so their message would be suspect then, because they weren't accurate in this very minor thing. They might be inaccurate in very important things of spirituality. So we would lean toward the traditional view to understand that Moses indeed wrote these books. And we understand that there are some passages, particularly in like Exodus chapter 15, 27, and Numbers 11, 7 through 8, where the idea of an eyewitness report seems to be most fitting for the context. Somebody like a Moses who would have been able to see these events and record them from his own perspective as having been there and been able to see that. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 15, 27, we read these words. It says, "They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water." That just seems like an eyewitness account, something that's specific to the text. So those sorts of hints in the Bible give us the clue that Moses was indeed the author of the Pentateuch. And we know that the Pentateuch shows continuity as well in its purpose and in its flow, rather than being a compilation of multiple authors. So I think it's best when we take the Bible literally to understand the Pentateuch as in that traditional framework of being the writings of Moses. The date of writing then of the Pentateuch also has some debate around it. Even when we take Moses as the author, there are some who lean to an early date based on 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. And 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 talks about the Exodus, the rescue of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt is taking place 480 years prior to Solomon's fourth year of reign. And so because Solomon reigned around 970 BC, this would put the Exodus at about 1446 BC. This is called the early date of the Exodus, 1446. There are others who would hold to a later date for the Exodus. Exodus 1:11 uses the name Ramses, and we know that there was a great pharaoh named Ramses in the 1200s BC. And so if this is indeed the pharaoh of the Exodus, then the Exodus would have taken place in the mid-1200s, around 1250 BC. Well, there is a lively debate, and I think that good Christians can disagree on this one, but it does make sense to look at the literal interpretation from 1 Kings that the early date of the Exodus seems to fit best in my understanding of that event. So probably around 1446 would be the date of the Exodus. Moses would have lived prior to that, been born in a very robust period of Egypt's history with very powerful kings and queens at the time. And he would have been able to rescue his people, the people of God, from a very powerful Egyptian ruler. And God's power would have been evident. So these are some of the things that give us a little bit of background to the Pentateuch. When we come into the first book of the Pentateuch, the book of Genesis, we have a very full account of events that took place from the creation of the universe right down to the end of the life of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so in this lesson, we'll pay attention to the first 11 chapters of Genesis that take us from creation down to the life of Abraham, where we find these very foundational truths. We think about the background then of the book of Genesis. As we've said, the author would be Moses around the year 1446. The theme of this entire book, of course, is beginnings. Everything had its beginning in Genesis. So we see the beginning of the universe, the beginning of humankind, the beginning of plants and animals, the beginning of sin. All kinds of things began in the book of Genesis. And a key verse for this book would be Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A powerful statement about God's creative ability, his workmanship. And it says, in the beginning, these things took place. The beginning of what? The beginning of the created order. God is without time. He is always present. And so he existed before creation, and he exists today. The Old Testament just takes the existence of God as a point in fact. It doesn't try to defend or try to make a case for God's existence. It just simply says he exists. In the beginning, God created this universe, created the heavens and the earth. And when we think about the heavens and the earth, the heavens would refer to not only the starry heavens, but I think space itself, and the earth, the globe on which we live. So everything, heaven and earth and everything in between, is created by God, as that very first verse talks about. And so we find that this verse is such a key verse to us. There's a literary structure to the book of Genesis that may not be evident to the average reader in the English Bible. Very evident, though, in the Hebrew Bible, and many of the English translations carry this forward as well. There's a word that's often translated in English versions as generations. It's a Hebrew phrase, toledot, that means the generations of, or the story of a certain event or a certain group of people. And we find these toledot introductions to different passages in the book of Genesis. So, for example, in chapter 2, verse 4, we read that this is the story or the generations of, as it says here, the heavens and the earth when they were created. Then we'd go down later and we find this is the story of Abraham. This is the story of others along the way. And so this little phrase, generations, comes up several times in the book of Genesis, and it does form a good literary outline for the book. We're going to follow a more topical outline. Think in terms of the book of Genesis in regard to its prologue, that is those first 11 chapters, and then we could talk about the patriarchs, chapters 12 through 50. So when we come to the prologue, we find these first 11 chapters divide nicely into four major sections: creation, the fall, the flood, and the nations. Creation, of course, is that description in chapters 1 and 2 of God's creative work in bringing the universe and the world into existence. God created the heavens and the earth, as it says. And here we'll understand that there are Christians who look at this creation passage in different ways. Some look at it very figuratively and would understand the time frames that are indicated here could refer to lengthy periods of time, or taken more figuratively. And others look at this opening chapter very literally. Real 24-hour days, a real and probably recent sort of creation. And I think there's room for good Christians to debate these points and to try to understand them accurately. Again, a very literal understanding of these passages would say God created everything in the universe in 6 literal days, 6 24-hour days. And this seems to be what the writer, Moses, is trying to indicate to us. Even in Exodus chapter 20, when he talks about the Sabbath day in the Ten Commandment passage, he says God created the heavens and the earth and everything in them in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And so we have this indication, at least we would understand from this passage, whatever approach we take, that God is a powerful God who can just simply speak into existence or will into existence that which we see around us, all that exists. He is a creator God. In chapter 1, we find then what we could call a chronological account of creation, because it says to us about each day. It says in verse 2 that God had created the heavens and the earth, but the earth was formless and void, or empty. It hadn't been filled yet with plants and animal life. It hadn't been fully formed yet. God, so to speak, spoke into existence the raw material and then began to form it into what he wanted it to be in those 6 creation days. And it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That is to say, we have a hint here that God exists in a triune form, we would understand from the New Testament and other passages. But here at least God the Father, God the Spirit are actively working in the creation of this world. And it says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. It is an anticipation of a creative or a forming act, that something is about to take place. And in verse 3, we find that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And this begins the forming and the filling of this creation that God has made. And we go through those 6 days, how God creates light, and how he creates light-bearing bodies like the sun and the stars, and how he creates plant life and animal life. And then on the 6th day, especially, we find his word about creating humankind, creating Adam and Eve. And so that becomes the focal point, and humankind becomes the focus of the physical creation that God has made. In Genesis chapter 1 down through chapter 2, verse 3, where we read about the 7th day as a day of rest. But in that creation of humankind, chapter 1, verse 26, it says that God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over all creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So we have this statement about God's creative work, creating humankind in his own image. That is to say that we bear some of the characteristics of God in his existence. That is, I think we could say that we are self-conscious, that we have ability to think and reason, that we have the ability to make choices and decide, these things that are built into us that set us apart from the rest of animal creation. And these are the things that God has done to make us a special part of his creation. That means that you and I are special to God. He's created us with a very special purpose. Chapter 2 of Genesis revisits this creation story, but we could say this is more of a theological account. The first chapter more chronological, the second chapter more theological, as it talks about how God created humankind and how he put Adam in the Garden of Eden and had him name the animals, and recognizing in that naming process that Adam was alone without a partner, and so God then created Eve from Adam's side and established marriage and family, as we see in chapter 2, more of a theological account of creation. We come to chapters 3 through 5, so that's the creation account. Chapters 3 through 5, we find a reference to the fall of humankind, or original sin, if we could call it that. That is the idea that in chapter 3, that in that perfect setting in the Garden of Eden, where God had created this wonderful environment for Adam and Eve to live in, and had warned them of their need to be obedient in all things, particularly not to eat of a forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so in chapter 3, we find that another player comes into the scene, a serpent. We're going to understand that to be an expression of Satan in a physical form coming into the garden and expressing temptation to Eve and to Adam, that they were being somehow cheated by God, that he wasn't really giving them a fair deal. And so he said, if you want to be like God, you're going to eat this fruit and then you'll know good from evil. Well, Eve and Adam subsequently together, they took the fruit, they ate the fruit, they disobeyed God. That disobedience brought sin into their lives and into the whole human race, and is ultimately the beginning place of all of the sorrow and the misery that comes from sin, not just theirs, but our own, because we bring much of that on ourselves. But sin enters into the human race there and then is passed on down through the generations, so that we all find ourselves encumbered with a sinful nature that needs forgiveness and remedy in the person of Jesus Christ. Well, of course, in that fall, we find that Adam and Eve try to blame each other and the serpent and hide from that. But God, in the midst of all of that, makes a promise to them that he is going to rescue them. And so we find in verse 15 of Genesis 3 that God said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. In other words, God in the very beginning of that fall says to the serpent, says ultimately to Satan, I am making enemies between you and the seed of the woman, and that offspring of the woman, eventually, who we would know as being Jesus Christ, would crush the serpent's head, crushing him at the cross where sin was defeated. And Satan, though he thought he won a victory, indeed was beaten at the cross, and Jesus is our Savior. So and that little verse is sometimes called the Proto-Evangelium. That is the very first expression of the gospel in the Bible, Genesis 3:15. The next couple of chapters, chapter 4, shows some of the expression of sin as we see the story of Cain and Abel and how they brought different sacrifices, or I should say offerings, to God. Cain brought a vegetable offering, and Abel brought a blood offering. And not a lot of detail is given to us in the text, but we can surmise that Cain's offering just wasn't done in the right way or done with the right attitude, and was not the right offering itself. Whereas Abel's blood offering was appropriate to reveal the importance of death for sin and the covering of sin with sacrifice. And so Cain becomes angry with Abel and kills him, murders him. So we have the first murder in the Bible. And so Cain lives out or works out that sinfulness in a very drastic and horrible act of murder. And so he is isolated then from the rest of the descendants of Adam and Eve, who begin to expand and populate the earth and have the beginnings of some early civilization. We find then in chapter 5 a description of some of these descendants of Adam and Eve as the population of the world is growing and as God is blessing them in spite of their sinfulness, that there is a blessing that's taking place. The population is growing to the point that when we come to chapter 6, we come to the next section of that prologue, creation, fall, the flood. And when we come to the flood, we realize that the population of the earth has grown to such an extent and sin has expanded to such an extent that humankind was almost wholesale anti-God, opposed to God, living for themselves. And so we find that there is one man who stands above all of that, a man by the name of Noah. And God promises Noah, I'm going to rescue you, but there's going to be a great flood. And so build an ark and bring animals on the ark to rescue them from the waters of the flood. And so we have the description in Genesis chapter 6 through 9 of Noah and his sons building this massive boat in order to rescue the animal life and human life through what would be a global catastrophe, a worldwide flood. And that description is given to us here in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. And when Noah had completed building the ark, the waters came down and flooded the earth, and all life, all air-breathing life on earth was destroyed except that which was rescued in the ark. The ark eventually came to rest, according in chapter 8, on the mountains of Ararat, a high point in probably what we would find is the Middle East, and finding that place of rescue. And so Noah and his family, the animals, were able to come off the ark to begin repopulating the earth again. And God at that time promised, I will never again destroy the world with a flood, not like this. And so we know that there is a future judgment coming, but not in that same way. God always keeps his promises. And finally, in chapters 10 and 11 in this prologue to Genesis, we find a description of the nations that came from Noah and his sons. And so we sometimes call this the Table of Nations. It's a roster or a description of the nations that came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in many ways, we find that the nationalities and ethnicities of the world that exist today can in some ways be traced back to these three. And so we find that this is a very helpful way of understanding the spread of the nations. And as the nations were expanding and growing in number, they were actually staying close together. And so they thought to themselves, if we can stay close together, if we can rally together and oppose God together, we'll be more successful. So they built a tower, the Tower of Babel, that story in chapter 11, where they were building a tower with what we would understand to be like a ziggurat, where there would be a place of worship at the peak of that tower, a place to worship idolatrous gods in opposition to God. And so God says, I have to step in once again, and I have to change things up here. And he did so by confusing their languages so that now these different ethnicities would develop and spread out because of the language barrier. And so there was the spread of people all across the globe, and we find that still today. And then at the end of chapter 11, after this incident, we find that in that spread there is a family that comes to the surface in God's attention, a man by the name of Abraham. And Abraham is going to become then center stage in the rest of the book of Genesis as the father of the nation of Israel and as the father of faith for our faith as well as other faith systems. But Abraham becomes the man of faith, the one whom God is going to bless. So we find in these opening chapters at least the answers to two philosophical questions. Where did I come from and why am I here? We came from God's creative touch. We are here to give glory to God in all things that he has called us to do. And because of that, then we have been created in his image. We are loved by him. We treat others with dignity and respect because of who they are and how God has made them. And we make sure that we honor God in the ways he's commanded us to follow him, because he is, after all, our creator.